Well, we're now 11 months into 2024, and it's time to ask that question: what made 2024 memorable? As a historian, I think it's always a great idea to take stock in order to see what kind of lasts through history. But the United Nations thinks that 2024 should be important for a reason that most Americans probably would find surprising. 2024 is, according to the United Nations, the International Year of the Camelid. Might seem odd to Americans. If you've encountered a camel at all, it was likely because you paid a few dollars to ride one in a circle at a county fair. But camels have played a surprisingly important role in history and are still vitally important to millions of people in the world today, and they deserve to be remembered. You might have noted already that I didn't say that this is the International Year of the Camel, but the International Year of the Camelid. Camelid or Camelidae is a biological family, and the family is slightly larger than you might initially recognize, as it includes llamas. And for some, that might not be surprising at all. The faces of camels and llamas are actually pretty similar, but llamas, or rather llamas, alpacas, vicuñas, and guanacos, are South American, a long way from camels, residents of China and the Middle East. That leads to another potentially surprising fact about camels, where they came from. The first known fossils representing the biological family that we now generally see as synonymous with the Arabian Peninsula occurred in what is today South Dakota. Protylopus fossils were first discovered in 1898. The critter probably lived between 50 and 60 million years ago during the geological epoch called the Eocene. Unlike modern camels, they weren't very large, with the largest specimens estimated to be about 2.5 feet long and weighing between 50 and 60 pounds. Numerous species evolved from this creature. In fact, various types of camels were common in North America until quite recently in geological terms, only going extinct somewhere around 13,000 years ago when North America lost most of its megafauna. North American camels disappeared from the fossil record about the same time as the short-faced bear, mammoths, and giant sloths. The timing of the extinction suggests that hunting by humans contributed to that extinction. But by that point, camels had already spread beyond North America. Fossils of a species called Camelus occur in both North America and spread widely across the Old World from Asia to Western Europe. This suggests that Camelus crossed the Bering Land Bridge, or Beringia, around 6 million years ago. Ironically, it was a later migration around 20,000 years ago of humans across the land bridge that contributed to the extinction of North America's native camels. But in between the two, another group of camels had wandered south and evolved into the four still remaining South American camelids. If this seems far-fetched to some, the Old World and New World camelids are closer related than you might think. Modern domesticated dromedaries have been successfully bred with guanacos using artificial insemination. The resulting hybrids are called camels. The two camels that were successfully bred in 1871 were described as, when mature, they had the muzzle and pelt of the New World camel and lacked a hump, but the deep voice of the Old World dromedary. This might lead to another question. How many humps did all these camels have? Of course, today there are Bactrians with 2 humps and dromedaries with 1 hump, and then the llamas with no humps. And the answer isn't clear. Most of this understanding, which itself is still evolving, is derived from fossils, and fossils tend to preserve bones, but not soft tissues, and, well, camel humps are soft. The prevailing theory is that 2 humps are a cold weather evolution, whereas 1 humps are more efficient in hot weather, and so the hump count varied with time. Quite possibly 2 humped camels evolved from 1 humped camels who evolved from camels without humps, while 1 humped camels could later have evolved from 2 hump camels. So at this point, I'll stop for a moment and say while the camelids of South America are interesting and historically important, we've already taken on more humps than we got time for, and so I'll save that for another episode and follow the Camelopolis across Beringia into Asia and talk about the Old World camels, although I guess from the camel's perspective, North America is the Old World and Asia is the New World, but you know what I mean. Of the Old World camels, there are 3 still in existence: wild Bactrian camels, domesticated Bactrian camels, and dromedaries. But even the relationship between these is muddy. The names wild and domesticated Bactrian camels suggest that the domesticated 2-humped Bactrian camel was domesticated from the wild species. In fact, that was assumed to be the case until quite recently, but a genetic study in 2007 called that connection into doubt, suggesting that the 2 species split long before domestication. That is, modern domesticated Bactrian camels are now thought to have been domesticated from a separate wild camel species that is now extinct. And wild Bactrian camels are a last vestige of wild camels that started in South Dakota and were, like European Sea of Americans, never domesticated. The world's last remaining species of wild camel live today in northwest China and southwest Mongolia in the Gobi Desert and is endangered, with less than 1,000 presumed to still exist. The Bactrian camel is thought to have been domesticated around 6,000 to 6,500 years ago, most likely in China, and that's somewhat counterintuitive as the name Bactrian is derived from the name from a Central Asia area. The name likely came from Aristotle, who was among the first to describe the camel in his 4th century BC work History of Animals. By then, the camels had been long domesticated, and Aristotle simply didn't know where they actually originated. The domestication of camels came fairly late in the history of domestication, after dogs, sheep, goats, cattle, pigs, and even cats. But 90% of the camels on Earth today are dromedaries, one-humped camels, and their origins are even more confusing. It was assumed for centuries that the dromedary was derived from the domesticated Bactrian camel. That is, camels were bred for traits that worked better in the hot climate of Arabia, and that selection eventually resulted in a one-humped species. And that suggests that there are no wild versions of a dromedary, that it was derived from already domesticated camels. There are two pieces of evidence that seem to support the claim. First, it was long asserted that dromedaries had a fetal stage where they had two humps, suggesting that the evolution to a single hump was relatively recent. And second, dromedaries and Bactrian camels can breed, and their offspring is fertile. These hybrids of a male Bactrian and female dromedary are often called Tulu or Turcoman and tend to be larger and sturdier than either dromedary or Bactrian camels and have been bred and used as draft animals since ancient times. The fact that the offspring are fertile suggests that Bactrian and dromedary camels are genetically more similar than horses and donkeys, whose offspring, the mule, is typically infertile. However, the assertion that dromedaries have a fetal two-hump stage came during the 18th century, and more modern study has denied that claim. Meanwhile, genetic and morphological comparisons, and their skeletons are fairly similar despite the difference in the number of humps, suggest that domesticated Bactrian camels and dromedaries are further apart genetically than once supposed, and that the split came well before humanity and domestication. Rather, the current thinking is that dromedaries, like domesticated Bactrian camels, were domesticated from a now extinct and not positively known wild camel. Genetic evidence suggests that there wasn't a single domestication event, but that the breeding stock was augmented with wild camels over time. But when did that occur? Well, a paper published in 2016 in the multidisciplinary journal PNAS, looking at population genetics, contends that the domestication of the dromedary took place rather late in human history. Dromedaries were likely domesticated between 2,000 and 4,000 years ago. And this leads to an interesting question of history. In 2014, researchers at Tel Aviv University were researching camel bones to determine when domesticated camels came to the Levant. The results were surprising. Researchers found that the discovery of camel bones coincides with a dramatic change in copper mining. That is, domesticated camels caused a notable economic shift, suggesting those represented the arrival of domestic camels for the first time to the Levant. But radiocarbon dating across multiple sites suggests that this occurred in the first millennium BC. That offers a challenge in that camels are mentioned several times in the Old Testament of the Bible, which has been thought to have occurred in the second millennium BC. That is, camels didn't actually appear in the Levant until 1,000 years after the events mentioned in the Old Testament. National Geographic notes that the biblical angle wasn't the focus of the recent research, though, just an after-the-fact observation. But the implication is that the stories of the Old Testament were actually written 1,000 years or more after the events were supposed to have occurred, by people familiar with domesticated camels, but unfamiliar with the fact that those camels were not yet present in the time of the Old Testament kingdoms. While this affects the idea of the historicity of the Bible, it also brings up an important point. Despite their relatively recent domestication, sturdy, strong camels had a significant impact on culture and economics. The introduction of the camel in Israel coincided with a different method of mining copper, using more centralized labor and more sophisticated technology. In addition, camels opened up vast trade routes between cultures. The journal Science Daily explains by the 7th century BC, trade routes like the incense road stretched all the way from Africa through Israel to India. Camels opened Israel up to the world beyond the vast deserts, researchers say, profoundly altering its economic and social history. Of course, the most dramatic of the land trade routes of the ancient and medieval era was the Silk Road, a network of trade that operated from the 2nd century BC into the middle of the 15th century. These routes brought trade and connection between East and West, vastly impacting the economies and the cultures of both. The UNESCO website writes, from their early exploratory origins, the Silk Roads developed to become a driving force in the formation of diverse societies across Eurasia and far beyond. And the camel, which can go days without food and water and can carry heavy loads, earning the sobriquet ships of the desert, was key to this connection. The website of the Asia Society explains, just as the domestication of the horse made possible the pastoralism of the steppes, the domestication of the camel made possible trade on the Silk Road. The deserts of Central Asia are impassable to carts and chariots, and horses are not hardy enough to carry pack cargo through the dryness and lack of edible grass of the desert environment. With the domestication of the camel, caravan trade along these desert tracks began. While these routes, and the term Silk Road was an invention of 19th century historians, took time to develop, the trade they facilitated was robust. The Asia Society notes that Chinese silk was known in the Middle East, Greece, and Egypt at least by the mid-first millennium BC. Ironically, one of the reasons for the establishment of these routes was for horses. The Chinese military wanted the best horses, which could be acquired in the Fergana Valley, modern-day Afghanistan. Camels allowed the Chinese to bring silk to trade for horses, and then those camels carried back the fodder needed to allow the horses to make the return trip. While the Silk Road had an enormous impact, developing cities, connecting cultures, and spreading technology, its historical impact might have brought the most devastating plague in history, the Black Death, to Europe. Genetic evidence from graves suggests that the plague began in Central Asia, was likely carried to Europe and China with the trade along the Silk Road. The plague eventually killed as much as 60% of the population of Eurasia and again dramatically altered the history of both continents. Camels were also critical to the West African salt trade. Salt is a vital commodity, but deposits in West Africa were in the Sahara Desert. Camels were the only method beyond river trade to carry salt across the dry Sahara. Like the Silk Road, the salt caravans were a critical part of the West African economy and development of West African civilization, and like the Silk Road, the salt caravans allowed cultures to be shared, notably the expansion of Islam in West Africa. Despite modern technology, camel caravans still carry salt along the routes that have been used for centuries. An indication of the importance of the domestication of the camel is demonstrated in a 2020 edition of the journal Middle East Studies. The authors argue that the camel was a critical figure in the late Ottoman Empire, used in agriculture to pull plows, irrigate fields, and grind grains, while camel dung was used both for fuel and fertilizer. Camel meat and milk were important sources of food. Camel leather was used for clothing, and horse and camel tack and shoe soles. Camel hair and wool were used to make clothing, bed covers, brushes, and pencils, as well as camels used to haul merchandise that helped to incorporate Western Anatolia into global markets. They argue that historians need to better understand the role that livestock played in history. Given that camels mattered to nomadic pastoralists, landholders, peasants, fruit growers, merchants, railway boosters, intermediaries, agents, and other actors in the trade, agricultural, and industrial network of Western Anatolia, why shouldn't they matter to us as historians of the Ottoman Empire? A 2017 article in the Journal of Arid Land Studies gives a similar picture of the importance of camels among the nomadic people of what is today Kazakhstan. Camels played an important role in the life of nomads in different ways, as working animals, as a source of milk, meat, wool, and leather. In the areas of camel breeding, camels were able to replace horses, cows, and sheep. Initially, the camel breeding was a natural consumer industry of nomadic pastoralist economy. Everything produced by camels was almost entirely used by the nomads. The smallest village, consisting of relatives, had at least 5 to 10 working camels, which were used to transport entire household goods. Camels have also seen military uses, where they are better adapted in some environments than horses. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote that camels, whose smell can alarm horses, played a critical role in Cyrus the Great's conquest of the Lydian kingdom in the 547 BC Battle of Thymbra. Camel cavalry was used by Arabic peoples, but also by the Persians, the Parthians, and the Romans. Camels were used by Napoleon in his 1801 invasion of Egypt, and on both sides in the 1898 Battle of Omdurman during the Mahdist War. An Imperial Camel Corps of British, New Zealand, and Australian troops was used in the Sinai and Palestine campaign in the Great War. Between 1856 and 1866, the U.S. Army experimented with a camel corps in the Southwest, bringing camels back to the continent where they originated. Many were let free during the Civil War, leading to a feral population with sightings as late as 1929. In 2015, Smithsonian Magazine noted a legend about one of those feral camels in the 1880s called the Red Ghost. It trampled a woman to death in 1883. It was rumored to stand 30 feet tall. A cowboy once tried to rope the ghost, but it turned and charged his mount, nearly killing them both. One man chased it and then claimed it disappeared right before his eyes. Another swore it devoured a grizzly bear. And if the appeal of camels seems to have faded in the modern era, certainly not everywhere, the BBC reported in 2021 that 40 camels had to be disqualified from a camel beauty contest at the annual King Abdulaziz Camel Festival in Saudi Arabia for, quote, receiving Botox injections and other cosmetic enhancements. But you can't blame them for trying. $66 million in prize money was at stake. While camels are among the most recently domesticated of the animals, they've played a surprisingly important role in history, facilitating trade, contact between cultures, and the rise of cultures and civilizations in otherwise hostile environments, and have brought to us, among other things, the camel hair blazer. But their role has not always been a positive one. In the middle 19th century, camels were brought to Australia in order to explore the interior, and that led to a large population of feral camels that have done a lot of environmental damage and still offer challenges today. And of course, camels aren't just a thing of the past. According to the United Nations, camels are still critical to the livelihood of millions of households across 90 countries. The International Year of the Camelid, indeed. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.